Here is Pennonia Dungo Wasp. This is an orange, but it is also just as much a bright sunflower yellow. It is notable the swatch shows as definitely an orange, as does the chromatography. The bright, very readable orange has a bunch of tone variation as the paper changes, and it shades a ton on all papers. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs well enough to not avoid it and is generally well behaved. This is far too light for me to comfortably read a full page. It would work well as a second color on the page, and I can't see needing a full bottle of it, but I think it's fun and usable enough to get another sample.
The pen for today is a Retro 51 Tornado. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we get to see both that kind of sunflower yellow and the orange, really showing off the tones that this ink has on this very white Clairfontaine paper. No feather, no spread, tons of shading all the time. The least amount of shading that we really find is in words like sets, where it's mostly light and then gets darker at the end, or follows, that does a little bit of the back and forth. But for the most part, we get to see a lot of shading, like in Principle on the first line. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Conservatory Keck Blue. Here is Pennonia Chestnut Brown. Here is Pennonia Zodlike Greenfinch. Here is Pennonia Argona Lilac.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is just a bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, showing much more of that sunflower yellow. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it doesn't shade nearly as much. When it does shade, it does bring out the orange of this ink. But mostly what we're getting here is the sunflower yellow of what we saw in the writing on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, though very much in the range of the colors that we were seeing. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade very well from the sunflower yellow to the orange. It's doing a very good job, though it's not shading as much. I feel like this is being lightened just a little bit from the tone of the paper. However, knowing what it did with the Portage right before it, I don't actually think this is a translucent ink. I think this is an opaque ink being affected by the makeup of the paper, not the tone of the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tones as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade nowhere near as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, and it is showing much more of those sunflower yellows than it is of the orange, though all of the tones are the same tones we had with the Clairfontaine. I do not think this is a good ink for this type of paper because it really hides behind the quad rule. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks.
Here is Califolio Anahuac. Here is Noodler's Apache Sunset. Here is Robert Oster Red Orange. Here is Zenzoi Juicy Orange.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get very much the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just a little bit flatter, normal for on this paper. Still showing a lot of that sunflower yellow, not nearly as much of the orange coming through. It's the flattening out of the tone that this paper tends to do. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, shades a whole lot less than any of the papers that we've seen, and definitely not standing out well at all against the quad rule. I do not think this would ever be a good ink for a student to use because of how bright it can be on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Geherban Kyanite du Nepal. Here is Monteverde Joy Sepia. Here is Colorverse Walk the Dog. Here is Diamine Scribble Purple.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter than we have on the Clairfontaine, really much more sunflower yellow, almost no orange. It doesn't feather. It does spread just a little bit, barely shades. However, this could be a really good alternative as long as whatever pen you're using does let you clearly read what was on the page. This could be an incredibly gentle nudge towards making corrections. Looking at the back of the page, we do see areas that it got deeper into the paper. However, a huge majority has nothing coming deep into the paper. Nothing bled through to touch the page underneath. There's no ghosting. You probably could write on both sides of the page if you're writing in cursive.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Platinum 3776 Music Nib is a dry writing pen and gives a bright but usable yellowish orange that shades extremely well. Off camera, I tried this in a very wet medium pen, and the orange comes out much, much more, shading down to the sunflower yellow. I think the dry pen, if you ink this, the yellow shading to orange, if that's what you really like, you prefer, or a wet pen if you want the orange shading down to yellow. Now, I love the yellow to orange much more, particularly because a good usable yellowish ink like this can be hard to come by, even if the way we're getting it is by manipulating the ink by the pen we choose.